Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a really fascinating, comprehensive, independent report on one of the world's most recognizable, yet honestly most complex religious organizations. We are looking at a group that is just globally ubiquitous. You've probably seen them in your own neighborhood, yet they remain incredibly insulated. This report, which was compiled from public records, court documents, and academic research, is going to give us a purely objective, data-driven look at what actually goes on behind those closed doors.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We're basically taking an iceberg approach today. We'll be covering 1, origins and core beliefs, 2, membership and global finances, 3, a high-control organization, 4, shunning and disfellowshipping, 5, the child abuse crisis, and wrapping up with 6, international bans and persecution. Our main goal is to cover all the crucial information this massive report brings to light, starting with that visible global presence, before we plunge into the intricate and sometimes controversial mechanics beneath the surface. So let's begin right at the top of that iceberg with Section 1, Origins and Core Beliefs.
Now, this whole movement actually started way back in the 1870s with a man named Charles Taze Russell and his Bible student movement over in Pennsylvania. He completely rejected mainstream Protestant doctrines, things like the Trinity and hellfire. But, it was really his successor, Joseph F. Rutherford, who came in and established the incredibly centralized authority we see today. In 1931, Rutherford formally adopted the name Jehovah's Witnesses. That was a deliberate move to break away from other Bible students who, frankly, just didn't want to follow his strict leadership style. And this setup brilliantly illustrates their strict theocratic hierarchy. It's a total top-down system. Absolute authority flows from an 8-member governing body operating out of their headquarters in Warwick, New York. They literally claim to be God's exclusive channel of instruction on earth. That unquestioned authority cascades down through their legal corporations, to regional branch committees, to the local congregation elders, and finally, down to the individual members, who they call publishers, knocking on your front door. Their theology demands absolute, uncompromising separation from mainstream society. They teach that Armageddon is totally imminent and is going to destroy this present world system, with only faithful Jehovah's Witnesses surviving the event. And that urgency, it dictates absolutely every aspect of their daily lives. They enforce strict political neutrality, meaning absolutely no voting or military service, and they ban celebrating birthdays or holidays. There's also a strict refusal of blood transfusions, which is a unique doctrine that the report notes has tragically resulted in documented preventable deaths. Moving on to our next topic, Section 2, Membership and Global Finances. Let's look at the sheer scale of their footprint around the world and how they actually pay for it all. Just look at the staggering scale of their global operations here. It really stands out. The 2025 data shows over 9.2 million active publishers operating in more than 240 lands, spread across over 119,000 congregations. They are, without a doubt, incredibly successful at global proliferation. But we have to juxtapose that outward growth with the internal reality. The report reveals some massive membership churn. Despite having over 300,000 baptisms in 2025, which are largely concentrated in developing nations, they only hold a 37% retention rate for those raised in the faith. According to Pew Research, that is the lowest of any major U.S. religion. To put it into perspective, it requires an estimated 40,000 preaching hours just to gain a single net new member to their overall publisher count. That is a whole lot of door knocking for one person. So financially, how does this work? Well, they rely entirely on voluntary donations, meaning there are no mandatory tithes. Much of their operational cost is heavily mitigated by a massive workforce of unpaid volunteer labor. This model has allowed them to amass incredible wealth, with worldwide real estate holdings estimated at roughly $20 billion. However, as the report specifically points out, they operate with significant financial opacity. You are not going to find any public, global audited financial statements accessible to the members or the general public. Let's dive deeper below the surface into Section 3, a high-control organization. Here, we'll examine exactly how independent academic and psychological researchers classify the internal mechanics of this group. A crucial point in the report is how they score on the BITE model for high-control groups, which was developed by cult recovery expert Stephen Hassan. As you can see, experts note systematic control over members across 4 key categories. Behavior is heavily controlled through strict dress codes and the active discouragement of higher education. Information is controlled by strictly banning independent research or any so-called apostate material. Thought is managed using loaded language where the organization literally cannot be wrong. And finally, emotion is controlled through extreme social pressure and that constant looming fear of Armageddon. Historically, to keep that sense of urgency and control dialed all the way up, the leadership has relied on making specific, date-bound predictions for the apocalypse. They made bold predictions for 1914, 1918, 1925, and heavily anticipated the end in 1975, all of which failed. Following that 1975 failure, where many members had actually sold their homes and deferred medical care, hundreds of thousands of people left. But rather than admit a mistake, the organization simply engages in post-hoc doctrinal revisions, packaging those failed prophecies as increasing light. Which brings us to one of their most controversial mechanisms for enforcing compliance. Section 4, Shunning and Disfellowshipping. The report details that committing a serious sin triggers a formal, closed-door judicial process with local elders. And these offenses are wide-ranging. They go from smoking or celebrating a birthday to receiving a life-saving blood transfusion. Most notably, simply doubting the governing body's doctrines out loud is labeled as apostasy, and apostasy is grounds for their absolute harshest penalty, disfellowshipping.
So that brings up a pretty devastating question. What is the actual day-to-day consequence for a member who receives this judgment, or even for someone who just voluntarily resigns from the faith?
The independent analysis reveals that it essentially results in total social death. Active members are mandated to cut off all communication with the disfellowshipped person. We're talking zero social contact, even with immediate family members like your own parents or children. Now, there was a very minor cosmetic policy tweak in 2024 allowing a simple greeting at meetings, which was largely in response to European court pressure. But the strict underlying reality of total family separation remains virtually unchanged. This internal justice system, which is handled strictly in-house by local elders, directly sets the stage for our most difficult but absolutely crucial section of this explainer. Section 5, the child abuse crisis. The report outlines a systemic pattern spanning decades across multiple continents. The organization utilized a biblical two-witness rule, meaning they required a second eyewitness to the abuse, which effectively shielded abusers from any discipline. Furthermore, Watchtower maintained a secret internal database containing tens of thousands of alleged perpetrators. Local elders were aggressively instructed to report abuse straight to headquarters rather than to civil law enforcement, and the institution has fought legal discovery at almost every single turn. The global legal fallout from this has just been staggering. During Australia's Royal Commission, it was revealed they had records of 1,006 alleged abusers, yet they had reported exactly 0 of them to the police. In Montana, a $35 million jury verdict was handed down specifically for organizational cover-up. And in Pennsylvania, the state attorney general had charged 17 elders and members by mid-2025. This clearly demonstrates an ongoing global crisis of institutional obstruction that's resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars in legal settlements. Yet to fully understand this organization, we have to pull back and examine the external pressures they face. Section 6, international bans and persecution. The group actually faces intense, state-sponsored persecution and outright bans in several authoritarian countries. In Russia, they were banned in 2017 and labeled as extremist, with over 150 members currently imprisoned. In Eritrea, members are imprisoned without trial and documented to suffer torture. And even in democratic nations like Norway, they face temporary deregistration over their shunning practices, though I should note that was later overturned by the Supreme Court in 2026 on religious freedom grounds. But here is a truly fascinating sociological paradox that the report highlights. All this external persecution, it actually works to validate their theology. Because they teach that the secular world is controlled by Satan and will invariably attack God's true followers, these state crackdowns cement the loyalty of the members who remain. It inadvertently fuels and locks in that very high control dynamic we discussed earlier. So when we pull all this together into our final assessment matrix, the report paints a picture of a deeply, deeply polarized institution. On one hand, they have fought and won landmark religious freedom cases outwardly, which has actually benefited civil liberties for many of us. Yet inwardly, they enforce extreme compliance, a total lack of transparency, and have a demonstrably poor child protection record. They claim absolute divine authority while systematically suppressing dissent through the weaponization of family relationships. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to consider today. When a religious organization sits at this exact, complicated intersection, being a genuine victim of state persecution while simultaneously being a perpetrator of severe internal coercion and cover-ups, where exactly do we draw the line? How does a society balance the vital protection of religious freedom with the absolute necessity of demanding institutional accountability? I hope this explainer gave you a clear, data-driven look at the reality behind this highly complex organization.